Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for our session on psychedelics. We are really appreciative of Dr. Brad Bundy for offering his time and expertise in this area for us today. The Coalition on Addiction has been starting to explore what psychedelics are and how the implications of their use may impact substance use disorders and prevention and treatment, all those areas that the coalition focuses on. So we are glad to be able to connect with Dr. Bundy to share this presentation. And if you haven't had a chance to meet him yet, this is a great way to learn about his area of expertise. So Dr. Bundy, we'd like to turn it over to you. And again, thank you for doing this for us today.
Thanks, Zach. I appreciate the opportunity to go over this with all of you. I'm going to forewarn you ahead of time. If you see kind of a furry blur go across the camera, don't panic. It's not a hallucination. I've been working remotely and about 3 days out of the week, including today. My cats love to buzz my camera and dance on my keyboard. So I'll try to keep them at bay, but I can't make any promises. They're pretty sneaky. About 10 years ago, Robert Sprague, then the state representative in this area, approached Dr. Coase, wanting to learn more about addictions. The opioid epidemic was taking off then. Dr. Coase got myself, a couple other docs to meet with him. I did most of the talking with my background in psychiatry, my experience with addictions, inpatient and outpatient. Robert met with us for about a couple hours, took a lot of notes, asked a lot of really good questions, thanked us and left. Said he's going to research it more on his own. A couple of weeks later, he called me and asked me to do presentations throughout the area about the opioid epidemic and addictions. Me doing the science, the medical model of addiction, him advocating for not only understanding and compassion, but help for the victims, just not only the individuals caught up in the throes of addictions, but also their families and society in general. I greatly respect and still respect Robert for that, and his efforts were tremendously helpful and appreciated. But unfortunately, not enough, and not through any fault of his own. I've been involved with psychiatry for over 30 years, practicing it. And it's just, especially in the last several years, exploded in what we are understanding about the brain and the illnesses that we deal with, which are brain illnesses. Neuroscience is the #1 research area out there. So we're learning so much about these illnesses, these conditions. It's so exciting. But unfortunately, our treatments haven't kept up. We need new and better treatments. Depression is now the #1 illness in the world. Almost 1 out of 4 or 5. Numbers continue to increase. And it's just not the suicides that are part of this illness, but it's just the morbidity, all the dysfunction that, we got some more people coming in. I almost feel like I just start over again. But they get back to it. In psychiatry, we're learning about the brain. We're learning so much about these illnesses, but we just don't have enough treatment. Depression, #1 illness in the world. Probably 20 to 30% of people with major depression don't respond very well at all to medications. Post-traumatic stress disorder, numbers continue to go up, and that is a devastating illness, especially for our veterans. There's really no good treatments out there biologically for PTSD. And addictions, they're the most costly of all the illnesses we deal with. And it's just not opioids and stimulants like meth and cocaine. Alcohol, nicotine take a greater toll. So we need better treatments. When it comes to treatments, what I recommend to my patients is not necessarily what I'm being told by outside sources, such as pharmaceutical companies or even thought leaders. And I'll get to thought leaders a little bit later. I want to know how medications work on a mechanistic level, cellular level, system level. And we'll get into that a little bit more later too. With that in mind, I've been following the science and the research about psychedelics for over 10 years. And I've been wanting to utilize these treatments for some time, and I'm not alone in that now, as I'll go over later. A poll last year of addiction specialists throughout the country, the majority want to be able to use psychedelics for treatment, the majority. So with that in mind, I'm going to get started with the presentation. Hey, the other thing is questions, open up for questions when we get done, and I am fine with any kind of pushback if people have some issues. I know a lot of people might see psychedelics more as a menace and opposed to a medication, but I'm fine. And if people want to fact check me, do it. I'd like to know if maybe there's something I'm not getting right. Okay, so here we go. Hopefully. There we go. Okay. The goals will be modest and I think obtainable. We'll start off with some basic physiology, and it is basic. Gary, when I showed him my slides first time, didn't want me to get into the weeds with all the physiology, and I won't. It'll be physiology 0.101. But I'll talk a little bit about body and brain physiology. It'll help us understand maybe a little about these conditions and also the treatments. Then I'll kind of move over into psychedelic history throughout the history of our species. I think it'd be good to understand that, to put psychedelics into cultural perspective, especially in this country. Then we'll jump back into a little bit of physiology, how psychedelics seem to work. And then lastly, we'll talk about how they're utilized clinically. So, physiology 0.101. What's kind of weird to think about, and don't do this while you're on psychedelics, is what we are. You can do it on psychedelics if you want, maybe it'd make more sense. What we are, what all life forms are, is just a collective. We are about 37 trillion little individual cells. And I'm not including what's part of us being the microbiome, which is the microbial cells, mostly bacteria that live on us and in us, which outnumber us. What we are as a collective, a bunch of little individual cells, could be on their own, but they team up, subspecialize, and organize into certain systems, primarily organs, to get more stuff done as a collective. And all these little cells have to be able to talk back and forth to get stuff done as a team. So we have all these signaling processes that go on between cells. You're all probably familiar with hormones, things like thyroid hormone, insulin hormone, neurotransmitters, which we'll talk about more, are signaling, chemical signaling between brain cells, neurons. Cytokines are signaling between inflammatory cells. People probably heard of cytokine storm with COVID, and that was just too much communication and too much inflammatory response that caused a lot of the problems with COVID. Modokines are interesting. Those are just signaling chemicals from muscles when they're in particular being used. Exercise, we put exercise in the pill, we get rid of at least half the medications out there. I won't get into modokines now, maybe another time, into lifestyle medicine. Okay, so bottom line, we're a collective, a team. All these cells have to talk back and forth. Now, we'll talk about the brain. I love the brain. I could talk about the brain for weeks, months, years. I love brains, all brains, except maybe mine at times, but the brain's amazing. So what the brain is basically a bunch of cells, talk back and forth. The main workhorse cell of the brain is the neuron. We have about 86 billion of them. And then we have what are called glial cells up there that are support cells. I won't get into their role, but they play a big role in terms of our brain functioning. And as I've said before, all these little brain cells have to talk back and forth, and they do it through these connections called synapses. We'll talk more about later. There's about 100 trillion or so synapses, about 100 trillion. And an important concept to understand when it comes to the brain, its functioning, its communication, is something called neuroplasticity. Neuroplasticity is basically kind of growth with the connections between brain cells. And that's important for so many reasons, including learning. And there's a substance released by some brain cells called BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic factor. Neurotrophic is growth. If you can get BDNF into a medicine, oh man, you would control this planet. It's very, very important, BDNF, for brain health, in particular brain growth and regrowth. All right, so a little bit about the brain. Now, what do brains do? Well, what brains do, all brains, including our brains, is take in information. Part of the information our brains take in is what's going on outside of us, what we hear, feel, taste, smell, taken through our senses. The other information our brain utilizes is what goes on with the rest of our body. Pain, heart, stomach information flows up to the brain. And then the other information, real important information our brain utilizes, is what we store in memory bank circuitry. So what brains do is take information in, outside, inside of us, process that information through the 86 billion neurons we talked about with 100 trillion connections, synapses, to get behaviors out, information in, behaviors out. What our brains do throughout the day. The example I use, someone's walking in a forested area or maybe a jungle, and a snake pops out in front of them. Well, our senses would sense the snake. Retinal cells take that information into the brain, maybe auditory, hearing the hiss, goes into our brain. And once that information gets into our brain, all the little brain cells will decide if and what to do about that information. Well, memory bank circuitry that is learned about experiences on their own or through others about snakes would send out the alert to the rest of the brain cells that pay attention to that information. That information would go to other memory bank circuitry, would have programs up there, which I'll get to later, of what options we might have for that moment, what options in terms of behaviors we might be able to engage in. There's kind of modules up there from other experiences we've accumulated in our memory bank circuitry. And then what our brain would do would choose what behavioral option was best and program our muscles to get that behavior out right away, which would be maybe run away or pick up a rock and try to hit the snake. So what brains do, information in, behaviors out throughout the day. And if you really want to know what brains do, it's try to get food and not be food. It's all about survival. Everything our brain does, whether we're aware of it, and kind of aside, most of what our brain does is unconscious circuitry. Everything's geared for survival. Not only survival for ourselves, but survival for other life forms that are important to us, be it family, kids, or whatever. It's all about survival. And with that in mind, our brain wants to be able to, well, predict what's going to happen in any moment with any events going on in our environment, predict quickly what might happen, what behaviors we might engage in to help us survive. So we start forming all these through experiences, through memories, all these kind of circuits and channels, constructs, modules that quickly kick in situations to get a behavior out quickly that our brain thinks helps our survival. And it's good that our brains can do that. And there's a lot of really productive circuitry out there and models and behaviors to get out, but unfortunately, there can be some counterproductive circuits and channels, modules that can get formed that aren't productive. So I'll get into all that a little bit later, but I wanted to lay that out now to give a little framework that will help you understand a little bit about our brains and some of the problems we experience and how some treatments, including psychedelics, might help out. So we'll get back to that, but don't forget that physiology 0.101. Okay, so I'm gonna kind of switch gears a little bit and give a little history about psychedelics and our species. Probably as long as we've been around, Homo sapiens, psychedelics has probably been part of what we've experienced. There's recorded evidence from over 9,000 years ago, cave drawings of people using psychedelics. About 90% of cultures throughout our history have engaged in psychedelics. And kind of, we'll talk more about psychedelics of different types, but part of psychedelics is kind of conscious changing phenomena. And so they've been used for years throughout the history of our species for spiritual reasons, rites of passage reasons. So humans and psychedelics go way, way back. Now, where psychedelics really took off in our country was in the 50s. I really like this picture here, good old days, right, to 1950s. I don't think this family was doing any psychedelics at the time. My guess is their drug of choice was probably Twinkies with a hot chocolate chaser, kind of a side. Sugar hits the addictive circuitry. So the 50s, what happened? Well, where it got started was actually back in the late 30s. Psychopharmacologist Albert Hofmann. He worked in Switzerland for Sandoz pharmaceutical company. He's the one that first synthesized LSD. It's kind of an interesting story how that worked. LSD, lysergic acid, is part of a fungus, ergot, and ergot was being looked into for it contracts blood vessels, might help for some medical conditions. So he isolated that compound, synthesized it, put it in a vial, and they did some experiments with it and really didn't seem to do much. So put the vial up on a shelf, kind of forgot about it. And then about 5 years later, he noticed the vial, LSD, not knowing what it was, and got it down and said, maybe I'll play with it some more. He spilled some of it onto his skin. He started feeling a little bit strange. He rode his bike back and forth to work, so he decided to ride his bike home because he's feeling a little bit strange, and he had probably the most famous trip ever. People that are into psychedelics celebrate Bicycle Day, the day he drove back. He was a little worried, but survived it, saw a doctor, and then realized maybe he stumbled onto something because of the experience that might have some benefit from some other medical conditions, including schizophrenia. Part of it is sometimes some hallucinations. So researchers, primarily medical researchers, began working with it. One of them that worked with this guy's named Humphrey Osmond. He was from England, went over to Canada and worked, but had big influence in this country. He was one of the spearheaders of it, of looking into it. And he wanted to use psychedelics, which can cause hallucinations, with alcoholics and have them get kind of a heavy dose of it and then have maybe a bad trip with psychedelics. So maybe it would scare them into not using alcohol because that's like DTs. So he ran some trials with that. And what he found out was the vast majority weren't having bad trips, actually a good experience. And a number of them stopped drinking and they started thinking, maybe some other utility. So more and more research went on. There were over 1,000 clinical trials, papers that came out of those trials, over 40,000 participants in the clinical trials during the 50s. And in the process, cultural acceptance was high. I mentioned Time Life magazines that do articles about it. The owners, I think it was Life magazine, did psychedelics and they wrote up their experiences. Bill Wilson, he was one of the founders of AA, probably the biggest. He attributed his sobriety, finally getting sober, to LSD treatment and encouraged others to pursue it. Aldous Huxley, he, famous author, Brave New World, and he wrote a book about psychedelics because he got involved with it, The Doors of Perception. Huxley was interesting because he was such a proponent of psychedelics. When he was on his deathbed, right before he passed, he did a psychedelic, I think it was LSD, because he wanted to really fully embrace that experience in the life experience. Huxley was friends with Francis Crick, fame of Watson and Crick, or Crick and Watson, which was from England, that kind of discovered DNA and the sequencing of it. And Francis Crick, attributed a lot of his creativity, understanding that, from his psychedelic use. I mentioned Houston Smith there because Houston Smith was, well, a very devout Christian, but his forte, his area of study was world religions. Very, very spiritual guy. You know, he did psychedelics, and he, partly because he knew other spiritual societies had done that. His book, The World Religions, is probably the go-to book for world religions. And I mentioned Ken Kesey there at the bottom. He's interesting. And I mentioned him partly because he's kind of transcends a lot of the cultural stuff we'll get to more in a minute. Ken Kesey was a student at UCLA. He was a wrestler, all-American wrestler, alternate to the Olympic team. There was a study with LSD through the psychiatry department at UCLA looking for volunteers. He signed up, wanted to do his civic duty. Kind of side, this study was being done behind the scenes by the CIA because they thought maybe there might be some utility for LSD for their purposes. So Kesey did some of the LSD, really liked it, but he grew from it. And when the study shut down, he stayed and worked at the psychiatric department unit because he could get access to it there. And there he wrote a book called One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. If people are familiar with that, it was made into a movie, won the Oscar. Jack Nicholson played the role. And he also wrote another book, and he was under the influence of LSD when he wrote that. And then he wrote another book under the influence called Sometimes a Great Notion, which won the Pulitzer Prize. All right, so we're going to transition now into the 60s, and I'll mention Kesey again too. So what happened in the 60s? Well, there was more scientific research that went on, a number of studies, but what also happened? Counterculture use. Timothy Leary, a psychologist from Harvard, who was doing studies on it clinically, believed, and so did some others, that maybe others that didn't have clinical conditions might benefit from it. And he was a proponent, advocate for getting it out to the general public, which happened. And where a lot of it went was to the younger generation, hippies. And it started playing out initially with, well, just kind of the peace and love generation. Musical groups got into it. I don't know if you're familiar with the Grateful Dead. Every concert they went to, they would pass out LSD. I don't know if you can see the slide over there about Woodstock. My slide's a little bit blocked, but Woodstock, if people are familiar with that event, substances were a big part of it too. But also what happened with it getting out into the general public was it became associated with the anti-Vietnamese war movement. Not that it fueled it totally, but yeah, it got associated with that too. So what happened because of all that? Well, the administration, Richard Nixon was president then, obviously saw this as a threat and wanted to stop that movement. He associated substances, just not psychedelics, but marijuana, with that movement. And so what his administration did was created the Controlled Substance Act. So the Controlled Substance Act, if you're not familiar with it, it kind of rates substances, often medications, from 1 to 5, 5 being the safest and the least or the most benign. And as you go down to lower numbers, they become more of a concern. So Schedule 1 substances, Schedule 1, no currently accepted medical use and high abuse and addiction potential. Well, they put heroin on it. I mentioned this cathinone. That's just a plant over in Africa that's kind of a stimulant. It's still being used over there. They put that on there. And they put psychedelics and marijuana on there. And that was in spite of him getting some pushback from medical people within his administration, including the NIH. So those became Schedule I drugs. Schedule II drugs, for example, there's some medically accepted use, but also abuse and addiction potential. But you can research them and you can prescribe them. And on Schedule II list is fentanyl, OxyContin, methamphetamine, meth is on there. You can prescribe meth. And then Marinol, I put Marinol. Marinol is just pure, I don't know how much you know about marijuana, cannabis, but Marinol is just pure THC. And when it comes to marijuana, cannabis, little THC can help, but pure THC by itself isn't the best. But those are Schedule II. So when psychedelics were put on Schedule I, it was basically a death sentence for psychedelics and a prison sentence for anybody that either researched them or used them. So what happened after that? Well, for a long time, not much was done with psychedelics. But in recent years, there's been a resurgence of interest, but also studies. What happened initially after the Controlled Substances Act, it would still use psychedelics illegally for recreational use. But there was a lot of underground clinical use that went on, where therapists that were familiar with psychedelics from some of the work in the 50s still did it and took a chance. They took a chance of being in prison for it because they thought it could help for a lot of the patients that might potentially benefit from it. And then in recent years, there's been more ongoing scientific research going on. Psychedelics got what's called, through the Controlled Substances Act, the FDA, breakthrough therapy status, which means that you can research those substances Schedule I if they seem to have some potential to help for some medical conditions and there's nothing else out there. So in the process, a lot of studies went on. I'll get to in a minute. And the other thing that happened, it's been happening, is states are starting to take some action, individual states, you probably guess which ones, when it comes to legalizing the use of psychedelics for clinical purposes. If you can see the slide there, Oregon legalized that for clinical purposes. So what was the federal's response to all this? Well, their response was, I'll tell you in a minute, but I mentioned about the research. Ongoing clinical trials. Initially, the funding, and these trials cost money. Initially, the funding was through private donors. I mentioned Tim Ferriss. I don't know if you're familiar with Tim Ferriss. Bright guy, neuroscientist, philosopher background. He was the first one that got kind of long format interview podcasts together. He struggled with depression, went through psychedelic treatment, which was the only thing that seemed to help for him, and has become a big proponent for psychedelic use. And I'll mention more about, well, Tim, he donated a lot of his money. I'll tell you where some of that went in a minute. Pharmaceutical companies, they've jumped into the game over recent years. Again, if you can see my slide, Wall Street, psychedelics, yeah, pharmaceutical companies are jumping in. I'll talk about MDMA, ecstasy later, but Merck has the patent for that, and they're already starting to get their marketing campaign together for MDMA. And the federal response to all this, they're funding it too. National Institute of Mental Health is getting funding on psychedelics from the federal government. The VA, they're getting funding. And kind of aside the VA, right now, what's going on with the VA is so many veterans are lobbying so hard for psychedelics to be available for PTSD. And there are politicians on both sides of the aisle, both sides, that are jumping in on that. Rick Perry, if you know of him, the former governor of Texas, has been a big proponent for it. And then I'll mention about Johns Hopkins in a minute. Johns Hopkins is one of the institutions, if you know Johns Hopkins Medical Institute, one of the top in the world, they're getting funding too from the federal government. Okay, so to get to some of the research centers that are engaged We'll get to the research centers more in a minute, but the big ones, the big research centers, John Hopkins, as I mentioned, Roland Griffin's psychopharmacologist, PhD. He's been working on psychedelics for at least 10 to 15 years. $17 million in donations so far. Tim Ferriss, who I mentioned before, the podcaster, donated at least $3 million on his own. I'm going to mention something about Roland Griffin's because it'll tie in some stuff I'll talk to later. Roland, good man. What some of his studies initially were on end-of-life use, which I'll talk more later. I'll talk about it now. End of life. Psychedelics seem to help out for people with terminal illnesses, in particular cancer. So many people, when they get a diagnosis such as cancer, something terminal, really have a hard time handling it. Scared, angry. They can't, because they can't handle it, they can't embrace the time that they have. And psychedelics can help for that. And Roland did numerous trials and with good results with psilocybin. The reason that I'm talking about Roland, about 3 months ago, he's diagnosed with stage 4 liver cancer. And it's just beautiful how he's reacting to it. He really didn't do, so he did psychedelics once or twice. He did a lot of meditation. But anyway, Roland Griffin's, he's one of the pioneers in psychedelics. I'll go over other institutions, but University of California, San Francisco is a big site.
Parking on the car and gravel. Oh, it's saying we're going back there too.
Hello? Okay. Rolling, UCSF, big center. I mentioned this guy, Robin Carhart Harris, because he has been one that's been involved with the research for years. He's kind of considered a rock star right now because of Michael Pollan. I don't know if people know Michael Pollan. Maybe back up to Robin. He was over in England, Imperial College of London, came over here. I've been following his work for at least 10 years. And about 6 years ago, I went to a conference. I'll make some references to these conferences in a minute. He gave a lecture. It was a big conference, like 6,000 people. I asked a few questions. A lot of people weren't, his lecture only had about 500. The others had about 1,000. Anyway, I asked him a question. He asked for me to talk to him afterwards. I talked with him for about half hour, 45 minutes. It was great. It was a highlight for me, but really kind of a humble guy, kind of a nerdy guy, and a great scientist. His fame partly has been through Michael Pollan's book. I'm going to talk about in a minute. Michael Pollan, he's an investigative journalist, plants. Time magazine listed him as one of the top 100 influential people in the world about a year or two ago. Michael Pollan's first books were about food. He wrote something called The Omnivore's Dilemma 15, 20 years ago, which is a go-to thing for Whole Foods. He decided to research psychedelics. He wrote a book called How to Change Your Mind. And Robin Carhart Harris was the one he turned to for the neuroscience part of it. I'll mention something towards the end with the resources about Michael Pollan. I mentioned MAPS, the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies. That's headed up by a guy by the name of Rick Doblin. And Rick, who has been interested in psychedelics for years, he was the one that figured out how to make it work for the studies, get breakthrough status. He's created so many good clinical trials. And his work has been primarily with MDMA, ecstasy, which we'll talk about later. And then other research centers that are going on, well, there's a lot of them, and one of them is the Ohio State University. This equal and insightful psychedelic experience may improve mental health. That's a study going on at OSU, and I think they got this study together to help all of us Ohio State fans over the last 2 Michigan games. I think we all probably need that for a little PTSD. So Ohio State, really every major university right now has departments that are dedicated, behavioral health departments that are dedicated to some research. And actually, Ohio Northern University, they're doing projects, rat studies with psychedelics and anxiety. I talked to a neuroscience student down at Miami University of Ohio, and they're doing studies with psychedelics and addictions. So it's really kind of blown up in terms of research. And in the process of all this, there is tremendous acceptance of psychedelics throughout the medical community. Every major journal out there, I don't know if you're familiar with JAMA, Journal American Medical Association, that's one of the top ones. They just had one in their most recent issue about psychedelics for, I think it's psilocybin, psilocybin for alcohol addiction, and listed robust results. New England Journal of Medicine, the other top journal in this country, has numerous articles every month about psychedelics. The medical websites that we go to for information, mainstream medical websites, probably the most mainstream for different specialties, including psychiatry is Medscape. Current Psychiatry is probably the other top journal website, videos, mainstream. I'll get to Current Psychiatry in a minute. They have numerous articles. And then medical conferences. Psych Congress is put on by Current Psychiatry, which is mainstream, AMA, APA there is out there for psychiatry. And they had a dedicated conference, virtual, 3-day, last October, just on psychedelics. Kind of serendipity. Today, I got my mail, and they're doing it again this year. This guy, his name is the main guy, Charles Raisin. He's mainstream. He's a good guy. I talked to him at one conference too. So there's acceptance right now throughout the medical community about these potential medications. Now, just briefly, and I won't go into depth, the different classes of psychedelics. The main ones that are being looked at research-wise are tryptamines, which I'll get to, and then MDMA, which is ecstasy. I'll talk about that in a minute, and ketamine. And people probably have heard of ketamine. But we'll start with the tryptamines. Psilocybin, magic mushrooms, that's a tryptamine. I'll tell you how they work or seem to work a little bit later. And now they're mushrooms, right? These mushrooms grow in actually cow dung. People go out and look for them. But they've been able to synthesize the active ingredient psilocin. So psilocybin is the one that's used the most. LSD does the same thing, but LSD is being used some in clinical trials, but not as much for two reasons. One, there's a lot of baggage right now with established over the years with LSD. But number two, LSD, an experience with that is usually about 10 hours, 10 to 12 hours. Psilocybin experience is about 8 hours. Well, therapists want to be done in 8 hours. And so that's one of the reasons that's been being used more in clinical trials. I mentioned ayahuasca. I think it's a guy over there that's cooking up something. I think it's a guy. Is not making chicken soup. That's kind of, you have to boil it. But ayahuasca is a plant, primarily in the rainforest, that's been used for a long time spiritually, but then a lot of people from Western nations have traveled there to do ayahuasca. Ibogaine is also a tryptamine, and that's the one that's been used for a while for addictions. People would go out of the country for that. Probably about 10 years ago, I was giving a presentation with Robert Sprague about the opioid epidemic. And I had a guy that came up to me that was asking about Ibogaine, and I said, well, I don't think necessarily you want to do that. But he said no. He researched it. He went out of the country to get it done. And you got to be careful with Ibogaine, though. I'll get to that in a minute. But and somehow he got in contact with me about 6 months later and said he was sober. It was opioids, and that he attributed Ibogaine. That's the only personal experience I have with someone that said they went through it. DMT is actually a substance we produce within our brain, the pineal gland. That's also psychedelics. It's being looked at and investigated. It's dimethyltryptamine. Now, MDMA, that's ecstasy, if you've heard of that. And that works a little bit differently. And I'll go over mechanism of action of the tryptamines in a minute. it seems to do some of the stuff that tryptamines do, but it also has a lot to do with what's called oxytocin, which is kind of known generally as the connection hormone, and it plays a role in PTSD treatment. And then ketamine, if you've heard of ketamine, it's kind of a psychedelic. It's different than the tryptamines. And ketamine, which is an anesthetic and has been used for years for that, now has the approval for treatment-resistant depression. It's done initially IV, now it's a nasal injection. And I've referred some people for ketamine treatment, just not me. Most psychiatrists are doing that now. So that's a little bit about the different types of psychedelics. Okay, so if people are considering psychedelic treatment, well, at least clinically for now, clinical trials, safety, definitely. You want to make sure it's safe. So toxicity, something called the LD50, lethal dose 50. What dose of a substance will be fatal for 50% to take it? That's the LD50. It's low for a lot of things, including Tylenol, acetaminophen. That's a pretty low LD50. For the tryptamines, other than ibogaine, they haven't been able to figure out what that is. No one's ever died directly from too much of a psychedelic in their system. So at least psilocybin, LSD are very, very safe that way. The ibogaine, you have to be careful about. It has a low LD50. And MDMA, ecstasy, a therapeutic dose in clinical trials is, I think, around 200 milligrams. 2 grams of that is about the LD50 for MDMA. So psilocybin, LSD, toxicity doesn't seem to be there. But you got to be a little careful about drug-drug interactions. Substances are metabolized through the liver, and sometimes different substances will impact on different levels. And so SSRIs are used for depression, Prozac, Zoloft, for example, and maybe careful with that. Other recent data coming out, maybe that's not a real big concern. And there's another antidepressant group called the MAOIs that you have to be careful about. And then, for the most part, though, at least the psilocybin LSD use doesn't have a whole lot of problems with drug-drug interactions. Well, the other concern when it comes to safety is addictive potential. PubMed is a site it's an archive of studies that have been vetted by the National Institute of Health. And it's kind of the go-to thing if you want to learn something about different different studies, maybe what to consider, what to use. So I just did a search for addictions and psychedelics, and over 2,000 studies came out. And there wasn't one that I saw that said it was addictive. All the studies that came out weren't about addictive potential, it was about being used for addictions. I didn't go through all 2,000 of them, but there was nothing there that seemed to indicate that they were addictive. And there's nothing out there that indicates they are either. So they're not addictive. So what's the contraindications for maybe utilizing psychedelic treatment? Severe cardiac disease, especially with this one I mentioned before, ibogaine, which really isn't being studied much in this country right now. Epilepsy, there's some concern that maybe people with epilepsy shouldn't be on it. Schizophrenia, probably shouldn't be on it. And then people that are actively manic shouldn't be on it. Obviously other conditions like pregnancy, for example, people shouldn't do it either. But for the most part, in particular, psilocybin, which is used the most, and MDMA and LSD are safe. Okay, so how do they work? Bear with me. Hopefully this won't be too difficult for me to express and for you to understand. So to understand how they work, go back and understand about the brain. Well, the brain, not the best looking organ in the world. It could use some Botox, but the brain's amazing. And then you got to understand a little bit about something called the serotonin 2A receptor. It'll be brief. I'll get that in a minute. And then you got to know a little bit about something called default mode network. And again, that'll be brief and it shouldn't be too difficult, but important to understand that, well, our brains and some of the illnesses we deal with and potentially how these substances might help out. So briefly, talk about brain cells, neurons talking back and forth. They got some chemical signaling back and forth, and you get stuff done. They do it through the synapse. One brain cell, when it reaches the end of another brain cell, these long projections, they send chemical messengers across to pass on the message. Those are called neurotransmitters. And I'm not getting into depth. There's serotonin reuptake inhibitors, Prozac, Zoloft. We talked about those before. The impact on serotonin. Well, there's 7. I won't get into it. There's a lot of different serotonin receptors out there. Okay. With the medical community, I might go into this more. The big player, it looks like, with psychedelics is serotonin 2A receptor. All right, we'll get back to that in a minute. So, and then, okay, that's enough about neurotransmitters. But, bottom line, talking back and forth through these chemical signals between brain cells. Okay, so here's the important part if you want to understand psychedelics. Default mode network, the default mode network. Remember, all these brain cells talking back and forth, circuits and channels, different functions that they do. We got circuits and channels for finger move, for speech, for emotion, all kinds of stuff. Cognition, whatever. Behaviors out, circuits and channels. All these circuits and channels. Default mode network is an important one. When it comes to some of the illnesses we deal with, I'll get to in a minute, but also maybe how some treatments might help out. I won't get into neuroanatomy right now. The prefrontal cortex, it might be in there. The prefrontal cortex is where it's called executive functioning, where we have these modules up there, possible behaviors to engage in from memory bank circuitry that we sometimes choose from, prefrontal cortex. The posterior cingulate gyrus, or cortex, is kind of involved with maybe which one to pick to some degree. It gets information from all these circuits channels are always communicating with each other. The parietal region is where we kind of store memory bank circuitry stuff. Okay, that's a little bit of neuroanatomy, the default mode network. I put in brain scans simply because once the research, you're scanning the heck out of brains to try to figure out what's going on. The one on top is diffusion tensor imaging. It's a scan. I love that one. It's prettier than the one on the bottom. That's kind of the connections between brain cells that they're assessing. You kind of see what's going on there. And then on the bottom is it's called a functional image. I think that's a PET scan. Basically, what those ones on the bottom do is just show what part of the brain is doing what in any moment by monitoring kind of blood flow to that part of the brain. More active, more blood flow, less active, less blood flow. All right. So default mode network, we'll get back to that. A little bit about scans. So what's the default mode network do? It's a pretty important one. Well, when activated, it's activated when we're kind of in the resting state. When we don't have anything outside of us that's drawing our attention. A lot of times during the day, we got stuff going on outside of us we have to attend to, depending on where you're all at right now with this lecture, maybe you're attending to it. If not, you might be in the default mode. Because the default mode is kind of the daydreaming, the resting state. There's nothing out there going on around us we have to attend to, so turn inward. What's going on within our brain, okay? And so what happens in that state is that we do a lot of self-focusing. Our brain's always doing stuff unconsciously, our behaviors. I'm not consciously thinking about moving my fingers, my brain's just doing it. So what we focus on consciously, really, for the most part, it gets in the way of our brain getting stuff done, and usually often makes us miserable because you got all this negative stuff, regrets from the past, anxieties in the future. We're kind of talking to ourselves a good bit of the day, the inner voice. And as I said before, a lot of it is just kind of junk that just gets to us, right? So that's a default mode network. Self-focus, time travel, going into the past, going into the future. And it's also a lot of the self-talk is self-referential, how we perceive ourselves, how we perceive others, how we perceive things going on with others. That's all kind of the default mode network. And it usually often pops into conscious awareness. Okay. So hopefully that makes a little bit of sense. All right. So with that in mind, well, let me back up. The way the impact of the default mode network, what's the impact of it? Well, it's kind of involved with what's called our ego structure. And our ego structure is our perception of ourselves, how we perceive ourselves, who and what we are. And that's developed through years of experiences we go through and years of experience putting those into our memory bank circuitry and kind of connecting all this stuff together. That's our ego structure, okay? The default mode network is involved with relationships, the same thing. You know, how do we perceive others outside of ourselves, the relationship we have to it? And again, that kind of experience and memory and all this stuff gets hardwired together. When the default mode network is at its worst, which a lot of time it is, and we're upset about something from the past or worried about something about the future, getting anxious, we have a stress response. Our body reacts to those possible threats. I'm so upset, by heart rate going up, and in the stress response, a little bit is good, too much is bad. It promotes inflammatory processes, and it's detrimental to every cell in our body, including our brain cells. We're under way too much stress. One of the reasons we're so messed up. So these mental illnesses that we deal with, which are brain illnesses, you know, a lot of this flows through the default mode network. Depression. What's the hallmark of depression to some degree? All the negative thoughts we have about ourselves. I'm a terrible person. I'm no good for this reason, for that reason. And again, that's partly from all these things with experience, these constructs, these modules that get hardwired together. PTSD, you go through a traumatic event, that gets hardwired, not only the event, the memory of it, but your emotions that you experience in that moment, the sensations you experience in that moment, and the thoughts you had in that moment. Those all got hardwired together. And when these things get hardwired together, these circuits and channels, they kick in quickly. Remember, our brain is wanting to predict what's going to happen, and there's some faulty stuff up there. And addictions, it's the same problem. With addictions, well, number one, a lot of people, so many people with addictions, trauma from the past. There's a high association with trauma, especially early trauma with addictions, and it plays out with our vets. But then all this hardwiring experiences and all these ego structures, people who've caught in addictions, their self-esteem goes down the drain, their relationships go down the drain. There's all these faulty connections that are associated with the addictions that are kind of hardwired together. Well, all that kind of in a way is through the default mode network. I mentioned about terminal illnesses already. And again, we get all this stuff stuffed up there about end of life. As a species, we far and away do death so much worse than any other life form on this planet. We spend so much of our life fearful of death that we miss a lot of it. Again, there's wiring, there's modules up there that kick in quickly and lead to some of the stress associated with that. All right, so the default mode network, hopefully that made a little bit of sense. Okay, so, well, how do psychedelics potentially work? Well, they work primarily, we think, at this point, through the serotonin 2A receptor. I mentioned that before. What they do is they activate the serotonin 2A receptor. That's where we think a lot of it flows. But the other thing that happens by activating a receptor, some other stuff, and again, they're really trying to figure out more about how this all works. What basically psychedelics do is down-regulate the default mode network. They kind of loosen up these negative connections, these modules. They kind of dissociate them. It's called dissociate. And they kind of loosen them up where they're not kicking in like they normally do with all the potential distress that goes on with that. They kind of loosen it up. They've scanned brains, people on psychedelics. Here they are, yeah. Placebo versus LSD, and they can tell, the difference in some of these networks. And what they've found out is people on psychedelics, their brains through these scans are similar to like maybe a 2-year-old. You think about a 2-year-old, they don't have all this stuff that's stored up there, maybe faulty stuff, that's hardwired together. So what psychedelics do is they kind of loosen these connections, depending on how much you do. And part of what helps with this loosening is the potential to develop maybe better, more productive connections. Because the other thing psychedelics seem to do is promote this called neuroplasticity, this growth and regrowth. It's a synapse. That's how we learn. And we're always doing that. But sometimes, for example, in depression, we don't do much of that. Depression gets better, that gets better. And so psychedelics seem to promote neuroplasticity, and they seem to promote release of this BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic factor growth. All right, that seems how they seem to work. And basically, what they seem to do clinically, therapeutically, in a way, rewires the brain a bit. And trying to let go of these faulty connections, our ego, and how we look at other people, how we look at ourselves if we're caught up with addictions, kind of wires things hopefully in a more productive way. So hopefully that made a little bit of sense, because now we're going to talk a little bit about how they're used clinically. Well, psychedelics are used clinically. Well, a big part is set and setting. I'll get to in a minute. Set and setting. You deal with a trained therapist, and there are a lot of underground therapists have been out there for a while, but a lot of people are really getting into getting the right training. And I'll go over how that training, set and setting ties in together. The psychedelics used primarily are psilocybin, MDMA for PTSD, and then dosing. There's dosing guidelines that go on. People probably heard of microdosing, right? For most of the potential benefit of psychedelics clinically, you need a full dose. For example, full dose of LSD would be 200 to 400 milligrams. Psilocybin, the mushroom, is probably 2 to 4 milligrams or 2 to 4 grams. Psilocin, the synthetic psilocybin, maybe 20, 25 milligrams. MDA, probably about 200. So those are usually the doses, the full doses that potentially are beneficial for some of these conditions I talked about, PTSD, depression. Huge number of trials with depression that show that it seems to work well. I've probably heard of microdosing. There's not a whole lot of good data yet out about microdosing. That's what's a real low dose. Microdosing got popular through Silicon Valley. A lot of people in Silicon Valley, CEOs, you'd be surprised the number of CEOs that have done psychedelics with microdose. Steve Jobs with Apple, he was upfront about psychedelics use. He thought it helped his creativity for that stuff. That's microdosing. There's not a whole lot of good data about there, but they're trying to figure out they think maybe microdosing might help for some conditions, including depression on a more regular basis. Kind of aside, when it comes to clinical treatment in these trials, it's 1, maybe 2 sessions of psychedelics, and that's it. And people don't they've asked people what the experience is like, and the vast majority say it's one of the most meaningful experiences they ever had in their life. But they say 1 time was enough. Okay, I changed some things, understood some things, and so usually it's a one and done. So it's not like something that's used on an ongoing basis. Okay, so that's a little bit how they're used clinically, but I'm going to talk more about set and setting. So set is, well, setting up, the verb, setting up the people ahead of time for what they might want to experience and what they might experience with the psychedelic treatment. So you start off with intention. What are your intentions? What are you trying to do here? What are you trying to accomplish? You know, maybe depression, maybe it's PTSD, maybe end of life. So medical conditions. Some people want to do it for spiritual reasons, just to understand themselves and their place in this world. But now clinical trials, it's medical. So intention, medical. And then you go over with them, what are you hoping is going to happen with this? And again, this is a series of meetings with the trained therapists ahead of time to work through all this. But therapists will encourage the person going through it to be open, have openness with it. And then part of the time they're dealing with fearful experiences. Sometimes some of that junk up there, supposed to be PTSD, pops out and can be pretty overwhelming. And you try to prepare them ahead of time. You'll be okay. We'll be there. We'll help you through it. And if it gets to be difficult, just turn to us. Sometimes you use the term a guide. They go through that. And so paramount to all that is to set up a trusting relationship with the therapist that you're working with. So that's set, and you got to get that definitely established. I talked with just the other day. I talked with a patient that had a bad experience, but she wasn't going to clinical trials, and I didn't tell her to do this. She kind of did it on her own, but she felt she was kind of pushed into it. She was not ready. She wasn't prepared ahead of time. She was very apprehensive, and actually, when told me about the dose, it was almost like a microdose. But I think what she took into it was all her psychological discomfort thinking about doing it. So important that people can consider this, that they understand what they're getting into and want to do it, and realize maybe what might transpire as they go through it. Anyway, that's set. So setting is just the setting you're doing it in, setting the now. Obviously, safe environment. You want a safe environment. And it's definitely recommended you have both a male and a female presence. There's so much potential for therapists, just not psychedelic therapists, but any therapists out there, to misuse their relationship with the patient. Lines have been crossed for years with therapists. And so they're putting into this, doing it with a male and female at the same time. And then you just want some stuff available, help as they go through the experience. Water, obviously. Eye shades, some people, sometimes there's a little sensitivity to light, so eye shades can help. But some people, usually what happens, people put on a blindfold and they turn inward and they just start looking at all these constructs, all this stuff in there, and trying to understand them and try to let go of them. So sometimes eye masks are used. Sometimes people encourage a journal, write down what you're going through. Sometimes music is used with some people, especially if they're starting to get a little bit having difficulties with it. Obviously have a bathroom around, because psilocybin is about 8 hours. And then just in case, medical care available if you need it, which usually isn't needed, but just make sure there's something there just in case. So that's setting. And then afterwards, follow up. Most people continue to work with their therapist, work on those issues, and it's so much easier to work on those issues after seeing a therapist. And again, I'm focusing on these other things, but addictions is part of this. You're just not getting over the addiction, but all the other issues that go along with that, probably PTSD, probably depression, probably damaged relationships that develop. So follow up with a therapist. And then meditation, we all can benefit from that. We all can benefit from some ways of learning how to dampen all this negative internal dialogue we go through over ourselves or whatever. And actually, meditation is, if everybody would do it and do it regularly, we wouldn't need psychedelics. But psychedelics, sometimes it kind of jumpstart that whole process. So definitely needs to be some follow-up afterwards. Okay, so that's kind of the end of this, sort of. Resources. I mentioned PubMed, total over 3,000 studies on psychedelics, PubMed. We want to go through all of them. I mentioned this place called Neuroscience News. Neuroscience News, you might get a kick out of it. It's the latest neuroscience studies, but they put it more in kind of layman's terms. It's just really interesting stuff. Neuroscience News, but they got over 500 studies on psychedelics. There's something called the Psychedelic Medicine Association. It's just a website. There's a bunch of websites out there, including MAPS, which I mentioned before, Rick Doblin, MDMA, ecstasy. There's some good stuff there. And there's tons of podcasts associated with out there. There's tons of videos, YouTube, it will blow up. OSU, Center for Psychedelic Drug Research and Education. But as I said before, just about every major university has a center. that they do, and they have stuff on those centers you can look up if you want to learn. And then really the one, if you really want to understand some of this, is Michael Pollan. He has a website. He has resources on his website that he refers people to. He's all over YouTube, and he's in a bunch of podcasts too. So that's it for now. Well, yeah, that's it. Yeah, I'm fine with any questions, any, I don't know, fact checking, if there's anything at all. I'm fine. I'm here. I'm done for the day. So any questions or pushback or feedback on anybody's part?
I'm sure one question will be, can we make your slides available? Can I share those out with the recording?
Yeah, there'll be a price. Anybody that wants it. Depends if they're local Hancock County, it'd only be $5. If out of county, it'd be 10. I'm just kidding. No, it's fine.
There was-
Yeah, I'm fine. Anybody, you can use that. Yeah, you can share.
There was a question just popped up in the chat. It says, were you saying that 1 to 2 sessions would essentially control addiction?
Yeah, there's been a lot of people with addictions, and including the recent studies that came out, the one I made reference to in JAMA. Yeah, just once. But again, it's the preparation ahead of time with the therapist, work on some stuff, and then it's a follow up afterwards. But yeah, generally it's just one time.
What about Dr. Bundy? I was wondering about the availability of this treatment. I mean, where, if people were interested, where do they go?
Go to Oregon. I mean, there's some states, I think Colorado, I can't remember which other ones, that you're allowed to do it clinically, and they have guidelines to do it. So yeah, people are thinking about it. And there's opportunities, I think, in other states, unless there's still a lot of stuff going on. But as I said before, there's so much acceptance and understanding right now. But it's still, we need more research, more clinical trials. I'm not saying telling people to go do it, but some states have legalized it. Some people, and definitely I don't all people do underground, but a lot of people do it underground. There's a whole network out there too. But the hope is, the thought is within the next year or two that this will be approved. As I said, there's a lot of push, and from both sides of the aisle, and primarily because of the vets, but also big money's involved with it now too. Pharmaceutical companies, they're jumping into it, and once big money kind of decide what's going to happen is there's going to be big prices to go through this too, unfortunately. But yeah, with pharmaceutical companies jumping in on, as I said before, I mean, I talk about the conferences are all mainstream. The thought is, the hope is within the next year or two, that it'll be available. And then once it is, there'll be good guidelines. Each state, the states that have are getting guidelines, but hopefully it'll be almost like national guidelines. And our societies will also jump in on it, which are now obviously wanting to consider it. So I think in the near future, it should be much more available.
In those states where it is legal, is it covered by insurance as a therapy?
No, I don't think any, that's a good question. I'm not sure about that, but I don't know. I'm fairly certain insurance isn't picking up right now. But that's a good question. I don't know how much it costs. My thought is that people, I mean, I don't know. I don't think it'd be much more expensive than just seeing a therapist out of your pocket. And it'd be a longer session. I mean, you see somebody for 8 hours and you probably billable, and not the bill you per day. I don't know. That's a good question. I'll have to look into that. But again, if it's usually just once that it's done, the addiction part, it's interesting. There were, and it was interesting about addictions. I listened to a podcast about ibogaine treatment, and there was a neuroscientist, PhD, Harvard, that got involved with it. She went to clinics out of the country. She's been doing this, and the interesting thing she talked about, when people went through the ibogaine treatment, including opioids, they didn't go through withdrawal. They didn't go through any withdrawal. They used the day before, they did the treatment. They didn't go through withdrawal. And some of the circuits and channels, it's interesting. I mean, all the with withdrawal, there's physical circuits and channels that get stimulated by circuits and channels in the brain. And sometimes we dissociate that and cut it apart. They don't go through withdrawal. Kind of aside with addictions, and talk about these circuits and channels, these faulty ones. And what that has to do with things that are associated with the addiction, people, places, or whatever, that gets hardwired up there too. And again, dissociating that and hopefully new connections, you kind of let go of that. And you don't get, in a way, the craving that's triggered by places, people you associated with the use. Those get kind of dissociated and maybe better ones to go on. So for addictions, actually, from what I've been reading, it's, usually, do it, turn inwards, kind of look at some things, get some help with a therapist, and you're good. It's a little more for PTSD and for depression and the life. It's also important to continue to follow up with therapists.
Another question we have is how do we make sure that it doesn't become another issue or another problem?
It's not addictive. It's not addictive. And believe I just look at the research studies. Oh no, when people go through psychedelic treatment, it's not like, hey, I want to do it again. I want to do it again. No, they go, I'm good. I'm good. Now ketamine, it's interesting. Ketamine, which is being used, it probably has some addictive potential. But I told you before, PubMed studies, there's nothing out there about. And really nothing out there from other research that says that these substances are addictive. They don't hit the addictive circuitry. There's not much dopamine, at least the tryptamines, that a lot of the addictive substances hit. So they're not addictive. All right. Yeah, no, it's different. Some people do it recreationally. Okay. But again, it's not because it's addictive. And some people do it fairly frequently because they think there's some benefit from it. Some people creativity, microdosing, but it's not addictive. But some people maybe use it more than they should because of those purposes.
Another question we have, Dr. Bundy, is what has been the VA's stance on this, and is it available within the VA system?
No, it's not now. But as I said before, there's a real push right now going on. Not only veterans that have benefited from it, but want others to benefit from it. But as I said before, politicians, both sides of the aisle, that are advocating it. And again, the vets, both sides of the aisle are for them. And so but the VA is not being used. No, not yet.
Okay.
But the hope is soon.
How would you recommend that we prepare the community to help them understand this more and support
Well,
them?
I mean, it's interesting because this stuff is blowing up right now. I mean, it's all over, media, YouTube, podcasts. I've got a lot of people coming in that are asking about it, and I'm telling them, don't do it on your own. Don't. And just kind of wait and bide your time until we have, hopefully, if the research continues to hold out, which I think it will, when we start having clinics that are have guidelines and regulations and all that available.
Have any of the clinic or the clinical settings that you're aware of, has there been an experience where after that the experience from the psychedelic has come back?
There's something called persistent, whatever, sensory stimuli. That's kind of controversial. But you mean coming back? What the experience might have been?
Yeah, and you're not in a safe setting.
Yeah, it was like kind of a bad trip, or are they hallucinating because of that? There was some thought that people might have what's called persistent. I can't remember the whole term. Hallucination type experiences coming back, but there's a lot of them are kind of on the cusp of schizophrenia, which is an illness in certain parts of the brain and circuitry that might be involved with that. But far and away, the vast majority don't experience anything like that.
Any other questions from our participants that we could share, or what anyone wants to ask?
Hi, I don't have well, I do have a question. I mentioned in the chat that I have a friend in the Columbus area who is getting ketamine treatment for treatment-resistant depression.
Yep.
I don't know where, I don't know what insurance company, but it was being covered and now it's been dropped. I think she might even be on disability, so I don't
Okay.
know how that her insurance coverage goes. But anyway, but she was getting it weekly, once a week, for a period of time.
Yeah.
Found it tremendously helpful, but is that an exception to the rule in terms of frequency or what?
Ketamine's a little bit different in how it works. It's
Okay.
not considered a quote tryptamine, which psilocybin, LSD are. And yeah, ketamine, because it's a little bit different, and they're still trying to figure out for sure how ketamine works too. It's through a different neurotransmitter system, the glutamate system. Yeah, often you have to follow up with that. For depression, you have to continue to utilize it.
Okay, thank
Yeah.
you.
Yeah, so yeah, and yeah, so and ketamine's being used, so I'm also looking into ketamine for addictions too, but I'm not sure, and I haven't seen any data about that, if you have to continue to use it for the addiction part of it too. I'm not sure about that part.
Thanks.
Sure.
All right, well,
Doc-
go
Dr.
ahead.
Bundy,
Yeah.
one more question. From a physiological standpoint, Dr. Bundy, you know, when you're changing, without getting into a whole lot of detail, has anything ever gone wrong, like physically, to where afterwards your brain wasn't functioning as well? I mean, it sounds like this is all up. Is there anything negative that can come out of this?
No, the only, again, there was some debate, some thought that some individuals, they think primarily the ones that are on a cusp of kind of an illness called schizophrenia, might have some persistent problems with hallucinations. But outside of that, and again, if I talked about lethal doses, there are some, Ibogaine, that you got to be really careful about that. But as long as you're not doing too much of a few of them, no, there's no damage done to the brain. There's no long-term problems. They're considered, at least like psilocybin, LSD, MDMA, which are being used in the clinical trials and potentially out into the public. No, those aren't toxic, and they seem to be safe.
Given the research that you've noted and the pretty wide acceptance among medical community, as you've stated, what is the big resistance to having this move forward? I mean, is it because everybody thinks about the 60s and bad trips and all that good stuff?
Yeah,
Or
I think
what?
you're exactly right. It has to do with some of the cultural baggage that's associated with it.
Okay.
That still holds over. And it's I go back to the vets on both sides of the aisle, but I think that if you got to look at who's for and against it, it's unfortunately another tribal thing to some degree, where the left seems to be a little bit more for it, and maybe the right a little less so. And a lot of different states, you saw Oregon, Colorado, they've legalized it. But it's interesting. University of Alabama, University of Texas, they have departments dedicated to psychedelics, and so I think that I don't call it ignorance, maybe prejudice is associated with that, will continue to go away as it becomes more and more mainstream through different medical societies. Again, part of it, big player is going to be the pharmaceutical industry that is getting involved with it.
Right on, Brother Bundy.
All right. Hey, kind of aside, yeah, I am fine. I'm good with questions. Good questions you all have been asking, but I want to kind of again thank not only Zach and Gary, and I think Dr. Costa was involved with this, for giving me this opportunity, for the people that are here. I go back to what I said before: is we need desperately better treatments, especially for addictions. And if there's something like this can be helpful, which I think it can, I'm glad you all are, if you are, trying to understand it and maybe be supportive of it as more stuff comes out. So I just want to thank all you guys. Thank you.
Oh, Thank you as well, taking the time today. We did record this session, so we'll make it available not only to the folks that are on the call today, but also we'll share it out to
Hey,
the rest of the
Zach.
coalition. Yeah, Gary, go ahead.
Sorry, do we have time for that question that Cheryl put in there?
Oh,
I'm fine with Quay. I'm good. I'm done for the day. And so far my cats haven't come around, so we've lucked out there, but I'm good for more questions. So go ahead.
thanks, Gary. I did miss that question. Cheryl asked, in your opinion, has this been studied more than the use of marijuana?
Yeah, at least in this country. Yeah. Yeah. Marijuana has been studied a lot overseas, but and marijuana is much more controversial. But it's overseas. There's been a lot of studies. Israel has done tons of studies on marijuana medicinally. But here in this country, we haven't had enough studies promoted, and then a lot of people's opinion from the medical community is based on the studies or lack of studies here. It's probably a little bit harder to study that anyway, because of the widespread use of it. But anyway, yeah, there's been more studies here, I think, pretty sure, with psychedelics and marijuana in our country.
Brad, this is Bill. Just for everyone that's on, thanks for taking time. I will corroborate and I certainly no expert like Brad is, but Poland and the research and JAMA did talk about this. Brad presented this very objectively about what's going on. This is not, it may also be his opinion, as he said, but it certainly is fairly mainstream from what I can tell. And I think one of the things, Brad, as we talked about before you did this, I'd like to get it set up so we'll do it as an official CME during time, presenting it maybe a little bit more with the dopamine research and that kind of thing to the medical staff. So
yeah, I would.
I
kind of tempered this to, I didn't get into a whole lot of the neuroscience, but yeah, I'd be glad to do that with staff, CME, and I'd get into more of that with them.
Yeah, well, thanks again for your time.
Yeah, well, thanks.
Yeah, for me too. I mean, this was really, and I know, yeah, Doc, I appreciate you kind of dumbing it down a little bit for people like me, because that some of the neuroscience and stuff would have been a bit too much, but I think this was the perfect amount of information, and I learned a lot from it. So appreciate it.
Well, I think one of the other things, just from the task force and the addiction, one of the reasons we did it for all of the individuals that are on is that there was a comment is, how do we be prepared to present this to the community?
Right.
It's got all of these connotations and the other things that they're talking about. So we'll just have to think about and talk about it. And we may be back talking to Dr. Bundy for his advice that way too.
Yeah, and I agree. I think that's the whole point is I think, yeah, we're just trying to base what we say to the community on, factual information and science, so yeah, the more we can educate ourselves, the better we can educate our community. So yeah.
No, as I said before, I appreciate the opportunity to do this, and hopefully, as you commented, I just want to get information out to people. And so let me know if there's anything more I can do. And I can, if addictions, anything else I can do. I think Gary asked me about maybe some other modalities that have been used for addiction, like TMS, neurostimulation, deep brain implants, anything else I can do, let me know. All right. I know how to do PowerPoint now. I learned how to do PowerPoint for this, which is good for me. So I'm ready for another presentation if there's something that could be helpful.
Hey, Dr. Bundy, I'm just curious, as part of our local community, medical community, are you getting any flack for this?
No, not really. I haven't. Okay. Well, maybe a little, but not. Okay. maybe a little. I'm not gonna mention any names, but for the most part, well, really, you guys are the first ones that really wanted to learn more about this, and not that others haven't, but I just don't think others know that these are other people in the medical community. I don't know much of them know or understand about some of this, and that's why if I can do a CME for them, I'd like to be able to do that.
Yeah, that would be great.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Mm-hmm.
Hi, Dr. Bundy. It's Prussia. I wanted to say thank you, and I And also wanted to share, I went to the global exchange, gosh, in the fall, where I had the opportunity to hear presentations on psychedelics. And I'm the one that came back and kind of said, this is going to be like the next big thing, and we need to be ahead of it. I think it's that same thing that we had with MAT, where, people were like a drug for a drug, so on and so forth. And it took us so many years to get acceptance for, all forms of MAT. And that's why I think we need to get this information out before it's presented as a negative thing that we're trying to do.
Right.
And bring it in as, a scientific thing that we're trying to bring into the community in terms of trying to follow good science. So I think you did a wonderful job of giving us an overview on that. And I really appreciate that we have your talent in our community to help us with that. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Very good. Any other questions for Dr. Bundy? All right. Well, again, thank you everybody for being here, and thank you, Dr. Bundy, for presenting it. We'll get this information out to the rest of the coalition, and please feel free to reach out anytime with questions. And if they come to me, I'll forward them to Dr. Bundy, or
really, if anybody has any question, you contact me directly.
his email address is right there.
No, not my email. I'll give out my email. To my office or whatever. Okay.
Okay.
Yeah. I hope to take it the wrong way, but it's anything personal. But the people. I just said before. I just dealt with addictions for a long time, and it's been so frustrating and disappointing. And anything at all that might help out, I'd like to be able to help out with. So just let me know. All right.
We appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Yep.
Everyone have a great day.
Take care.
Thank you, Dr. Bundy.